Friends, this video is not recommended for viewers who are emotionally sensitive, underage, or simply easily disturbed. Some of the content in this episode is truly shocking. Many of you have probably heard of the horrific human experiments conducted by Dr. Mengele at Auschwitz. 1,000 victims were tortured to death, with no practical benefit. But human experimentation wasn't unique to Nazi Germany. Around the same time, the Japanese unit 731 made its own mark on history, and that's putting it mildly. These people, if you can call them that, were operating during the same years as Mengele's death factories. World War II claimed tens of millions of lives. Some stories are widely known, like the final solution. Others, like Japan's attempt to create a plague bomb, remain in the shadows, even though they led to the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians in occupied China. In the end, the documents were destroyed. The leaders behind it all escaped any real punishment. Japan didn't officially acknowledge the existence of Unit 731 until the 1990s. Before that, the group was listed in records under the name Department of Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification of the Kwantung Army. Just another bland name for what looked like a routine medical unit. So, what exactly was Unit 731? It wasn't a concentration camp in the way we usually understand the term. There were no massive barracks, no gas chambers, no forced labor. The unit's purpose was far more scientific, at least on paper, to study the limits of the human body as thoroughly as possible without any concern for morality. They wanted to understand how the body reacts to cold, pressure, disease, blood loss, and shrapnel. The unit was headed by military surgeon Shirō Ishii, a man who, to put it mildly, had a particular personality. Ishii came from a wealthy, noble Japanese family. He excelled in school, but his classmates considered him arrogant and brash. After finishing medical school, he worked briefly in the army before being sent off for further postgraduate training. Even there, Ishii stood out as a capable student who simply didn't care about other people. For example, he would regularly conduct experiments late at night using lab equipment that others had painstakingly cleaned. And he never cleaned up after himself, irritating everyone, including the professors. Instead of keeping pets, Ishii kept bacteria cultures in test tubes. A hardcore nationalist and devoted follower of the emperor, he began advocating as early as 1926 for Japan to develop its own biological weapons program. In 1928, he traveled through Europe, studying how poison gas had been used during World War I. Europeans, for the most part, had already deemed chemical warfare inhumane and banned it. But the young Japanese doctor came to the opposite conclusion. He saw it as an incredibly effective way to deal with enemy troops. He began lobbying hard for Japan to create its own chemical and biological arsenal. Thanks to that, he quickly attracted powerful allies. His biggest supporter was the Minister of the Army. Ishii's career took off, and in 1936 he was appointed head of the newly established Unit 731. He arrived at the unit with the rank of major, and over the course of the war, rose to lieutenant general. Ishii earned his rank and decorations by orchestrating the deaths of a massive number of prisoners of war and civilians. According to the highest estimates, around 500,000 people were killed. The main Unit 731 complex wasn't located in Japan. It was built in Manchuria, a region of China occupied by the Japanese during the war. This location was chosen deliberately as it made transporting prisoners easier. Incidentally, this wasn't Japan's first attempt at creating such a laboratory. Back in 1932, Ishii had headed what was then called the Togo unit, which already resembled a future murder factory. Prisoners were brought in, fed well, and had all their health metrics tracked. Then once the doctors determined that the person was completely healthy, they would be killed in one of several horrifying ways. Sometimes all their blood was slowly drained just to see how long they'd survive. Other times they were starved to death or deliberately infected with deadly diseases. That facility had to be shut down after just 2 years when one prisoner managed to escape. He could have exposed the location and revealed the horrors taking place there. The Japanese response was swift. They shut everything down, burned the buildings, executed the remaining prisoners, and relocated the operation. This time, Ishii learned from past mistakes. He ordered Unit 731's main facility to be constructed like a fortress, and in all the years it operated, no one ever escaped. Let me warn you again. If you're easily disturbed, it might be best to stop here. The things I'm about to describe, sick. They're horrifying. It shows that humanity can sometimes act worse than beasts, and that some individuals are worse than devils. The people behind Unit 731 were exactly that. Prisoners had no names. Upon arrival, they were given a 3-digit number and locked alone in cells, chained. There were no mass barracks like in Germany. The Japanese took the dehumanization of their victims to a new level. Prisoners weren't seen as people at all. The staff referred to them as logs. That term started as a dark joke because, on paper, the facility was officially listed as a lumber mill. Amazingly, even during the war, scientists from Unit 731 were publishing their research in international journals. The articles detailed each stage of the experiments, but claimed they had been performed not on humans, but on Manchurian monkeys. There were several ways to become a test subject in Unit 731. Unlike Germany, where people were sent to camps simply for being Jewish, the Japanese didn't follow strict racial policies. Prisoners were chosen more by social status, if you can even call it that. The camp took in common criminals, partisans, political prisoners, the homeless, and anyone the military police suspected of anti-Japanese activity. Roughly 70% of the prisoners were Chinese. The rest were a mix. Captured Russians, Indians, even some New Zealanders. Gender and age didn't matter. Women, the elderly, and even children were sent there. Some women were forcibly impregnated so that experiments could be conducted on pregnant subjects. And needless to say, Ishii wasn't the only doctor involved. Around 300 scientists from all over Japan took part in the torture, and practically none of them ever showed the slightest sign of remorse. I'll get to the actual experiments in a moment, but for now it's worth noting that not all of them had clear scientific goals. Often Japanese doctors did things just to see what would happen, out of so-called professional curiosity, like watching what happens to a body when you cut off the head, or what happens if you remove the stomach and connect the esophagus directly to the intestines. The prisoners were seen as expendable. Kill one, and they'd bring you another the next day. There was no need to be pragmatic or efficient. There was an endless supply of human subjects. And if this is how they treated minor tests, you can imagine what the more serious experiments look like. Prisoners were deliberately infected with bacteria that cause plague, typhus, and other diseases. To study venereal infections, they were forced to have sex under observation, just to track how the diseases spread. Women were forcibly impregnated to see if illnesses could be passed to the fetus. Sometimes guards raped women just because they could, with no scientific justification at all. But even that wasn't the worst of it. To understand how a disease affects the human body from the inside, you'd need to look inside. So what did they do? Simple. They cut people open, from the chest down to the pelvis, while still alive. No anesthesia. Why waste it? Anesthesia was needed on the front lines, and prisoners? They were disposable, and it wasn't just about disease. Logs had limbs amputated to study blood loss. Parts of the lungs, liver, and even brain were removed just to see what would happen. And this kind of live dissection wasn't unique to Unit 731. More than 1,000 military doctors across occupied China were doing the same. But it didn't stop there. The unit also used live humans for weapons testing. Grenades, flamethrowers. Prisoners were taken to a test range, dressed in different types of clothing, and exposed to controlled explosions at various distances, all to calculate the most effective killing radius. They tested everything, from shrapnel artillery shells to bayonets and knives, on real people. If someone survived, they'd try to treat them. Not out of compassion, but to see which injuries could be healed and which were fatal. In fact, figuring out how, with what, and how quickly a person could be killed was the central aim of many experiments, and the methods grew increasingly brutal. Prisoners were starved. I've already mentioned that, but they were also locked inside pressure chambers where the air was slowly removed. In Germany, similar things happened, But the Japanese often went even further. In some pressure chamber tests, the victims weren't just suffocated, their bodies literally burst. Prisoners were also burned alive, injected with horse blood to test compatibility, hung upside down for days, crushed under heavy weights, electrocuted, deprived of water, spun in centrifuges until death, exposed to radiation and chemical agents, and in some cases, buried alive. Some of these tests were later described by the participants themselves as psychopathic and sadistic, with no practical military use. For example, there were experiments just to see how long it would take for a 3-day-old infant to freeze to death. Sometimes dissections weren't even for study, they were for demonstration. A visiting Japanese general might say, "I'd like to see what lungs look like from the inside," and the scientists would salute and prepare the operating room immediately. One of the lead researchers on frostbite, Hisato Yoshimura, even published a scientific paper with a film based on these human experiments. Though the footage captured the deaths of 2 adults, not infants, the brutality remained staggering, and the cruelty didn't stay confined to the Unit 731 compound. There was a university in Harbin where students of many nationalities studied. One day, a delegation from Unit 731 showed up in the middle of class, gathered a group of young men, brought them to a hall, stripped them, attached sensors, and forced them to submerge their hands in freezing water. After about half an hour, with most of the test subjects passing out, the Japanese halted the experiment, helped warm their fingers, politely apologized, and left. No remorse whatsoever. In the same paper published after the war, Yoshimura calmly wrote that he had frozen 20 children to death and used the data to create a frostbite resistance index. His observations were so detailed they included time of day, hunger level, physical activity, and dozens of other factors. When accused of inhuman practices, Yoshimura simply said, "These experiments saved thousands of lives." In 1978, he received a state award from the emperor himself. But I doubt the logs, as the victims were called, would have agreed to die in agony for the sake of future generations. Why didn't anyone escape? Because no one even knew where they were. Prisoners were transported at night in windowless vehicles. For the final stretch, the road was underground. They couldn't see landscapes, sky, anything. Once inside, they were locked in tiny, windowless isolation cells. The only door led to a maze of corridors with no clear exits. In all the years of its operation, there was only one uprising. 2 Russian POWs managed to start it. One pretended to be ill. When a guard entered his cell, the prisoner attacked, took his keys, and opened as many doors as he could, freeing dozens of others. But the maze proved too complex. Guards quickly responded and gunned everyone down. Considering the tortures that awaited them otherwise, you could almost say they were the lucky ones. The average prisoner in Unit 731 lasted about 2 months. If they were lucky, they lived a year. Here's another disturbing fact. For the Japanese scientists, it really didn't matter who they killed in the name of science. One doctor, Yoshio Sudo, accidentally contracted the plague during one of the experiments. You'd think they would isolate him and try to treat him aggressively, right? Not at all. The doctors observed him the same way they did with regular test subjects, tracking his weight loss, the appearance of purple patches on his skin, and how his breathing worsened day by day. And in the end, just like all the others, he was tied to an operating table and had his organs removed. Apparently, Sudo didn't realize what was happening until the last moment. Witnesses say he only started screaming when he saw his former colleague approaching with a scalpel. But Unit 731 wasn't infamous just for its grotesque experiments. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that the estimated number of victims was around 500,000. Clearly, 300 doctors couldn't have killed that many people with their own hands, even over several years of war. So where did those numbers come from? Once again, it comes back to Unit 731's main mission: developing biological weapons. Fighting on the front lines is dangerous and costly. It's far easier to start an epidemic behind enemy lines and then march into abandoned cities. But like any other weapon, biological arms need to be tested. Early attempts without testing often failed. For example, in 1939, during battles between Japanese and Soviet forces near Khalkhin Gol, Ishii's team tried to infect Soviet troops with typhoid. They poured barrels of infected water into a river that flowed toward Soviet positions. But something went wrong. No one got sick. So before their next deployment, they decided to test the new weapons on civilians. No joke. There was no selective targeting. Japanese planes began dropping plague-infected fleas directly onto towns. The first targets were Ningbo and Kuzhou in 1940. Tens of thousands died from the plague, and it didn't stop there. In Nanjing, the Japanese infected water wells with typhoid bacteria. Within days, a major outbreak began. Japanese researchers were thrilled. Typhoid, they concluded, was the most effective disease. In total, Japan carried out 12 of these biological attacks across 11 Chinese cities. Victims were infected not just with plague and typhoid, but with cholera, smallpox, botulism, and anthrax. Sometimes contaminated packages were disguised as humanitarian aid. Once the epidemic broke out, Japanese soldiers in protective suits entered the area and studied the dying. The design for the flea bomb was personally proposed by Unit 731's commander, Ishii. There's even one case where the Japanese accidentally used the bomb on their own troops. A cholera bomb was dropped near a city close to a Japanese army base, killing 10,000 Chinese civilians and 1,700 Japanese soldiers. The Chinese government sent medical teams to the affected areas to treat victims and document the attack. Chinese scientists compiled a report and sent it to the Allied powers, but it was mostly ignored. It wasn't until 1943 that Franklin D. Roosevelt officially condemned Japan's use of biological weapons. All in all, about 400,000 civilians are believed to have died during these tests. And what's worse, these plague bombs were never used in any actual military operations. All those deaths, completely pointless. The Japanese had big plans. Ishii pushed hard for a biological attack on California. At first, one of the ministers opposed it, but eventually a date was set, and then the war ended. In 1945, the territory where Unit 731's main complex was located was seized by the Red Army. The Japanese had to flee in a hurry, abandoning equipment, and receive direct orders to cover their tracks, destroy documents, execute the remaining 300 prisoners, and even shoot the 600 staff members. The facility was blown up, and each officer and doctor was given a cyanide capsule in case of capture to prevent any leaks. So how did we even find out what really happened in Unit 731, given all this secrecy? That's thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, not the KFC guy, but a real one, who arrived in Japan right after the war to investigate Japan's biological weapons program. Naturally, he had no idea about Unit 731, but he found the one argument that worked. He threatened to hand over the scientists to the Soviets if they didn't cooperate. That did the trick. The very next day, Sanders received a handwritten confession and passed it directly to General MacArthur. That was the moment the Americans first discovered the true horror of what the Japanese had done. But remember how I said hardly anyone was punished? How was that possible? After all, many Nazi camp doctors were executed or sentenced to long prison terms. The reason? MacArthur quietly granted immunity to the leadership of Unit 731. Why? To ensure the details of Japan's biological warfare program remained secret, especially from the Soviet Union. Japan held its own version of a war crimes tribunal, but not a single doctor from Unit 731 was put on trial. The prosecutor mentioned poison experiments once, and that was it. Shirō Ishii lived out his life in peace. He even traveled to the US to give lectures. Back in Japan, he opened a clinic for the poor and treated patients for free. Another doctor became the director of a major pharmaceutical company and held the job until his death. So yes, they murdered countless people and then went on to have respectable careers. Now, was Japan's fear of the USSR actually justified? And was the American decision to trade justice for secrets really the lesser evil? In 1949, the Soviet Union held its own tribunal for captured Japanese officers. Crimes committed by Unit 731 were openly discussed. 7 generals and doctors were sentenced to prison, terms ranging from 2 to 25 years. Even by Soviet standards, those sentences were unusually lenient for war criminals. Worse still, All of them were released in the 1950s and returned home. It's been said that some of these doctors were later offered deals to write memoirs detailing the horrors of the camps, and not a single one accepted. Probably because most of them hadn't been in the camps at all. There's good reason to believe the Soviets, like the Americans, let them go in exchange for information on biological warfare. So in the end, we're left with a grim paradox. Out of mutual fear between two superpowers, Japanese war criminals walked free. As you might remember from our episode about Mossad, even Nazi fugitives like Eichmann were found and brought to justice 10 years later. But here the reality played out differently. And yet deep down we still want to believe that evil shouldn't walk away untouched. Some truths are hard, but worth facing. Take care.